a programming lecture on video. Today we're going to look at nested loops. It's going to be our first taste of creating a program with nested loops. And this is a very important concept because we're going to find we're going to use nested loops a lot in the next several weeks. So this is good stuff. So let's take a look at the specs. We have a teacher who needs to get the average for each of her students' test scores. The teacher gave 3 tests to each student in the class. We're going to write a program that will first ask the teacher how many students are in the class, and then the program is going to allow the teacher to enter the test scores for each of the students in her class. And the program is then going to calculate the average for each student, just one by one, and display the student's average. And it says here we can either use while loops, do while loops, or one of each. So it's your choice. You can mix and match or whatever. I'm just going to use while loops only, and we're going to see later on that this can be done much more efficiently and elegantly with for loops, which is a different kind of loop we'll be learning about very soon. So let's take a look here at some key points. We can see that the program's going to have to process an unknown number of students, but we'll capture the number of students right at the beginning of the program by prompting the teacher to tell us how many students are in the class. We're going to have 2 counters. One is going to count up the number of students in the class, and the other one's going to keep track of the number of test scores that we're entering. So after we obtain the number of students from the teacher, we're going to use a counter-controlled loop. That's going to be the outer loop, and it'll continue to run as long as there are students to process. And then the inner loop, which is going to process each student and get their 3 test scores. And so that loop is going to have its own little counter, little test counter, but it's also going to have an accumulator to keep a running total of the test scores, because you know the formula for calculating an average is you sum up all the test scores and divide by how many tests there were. So this accumulator is going to need to get reset back to 0 for each and every student that's going to get processed. You don't want to add up all the test scores in the entire class, and that would just give like a big old class average for all the tests, which we're not being asked to do here. So after the inner loop is done, you go back to the outer loop and update, the counter there, next student, and then the inner loop processes it again, and so on. But remember, the average formula is going to be outside of the inner loop, but inside the outer loop. In other words, don't calculate the average while you're still in the process of grabbing test scores. Finally, we're going to display it looking like this. For example, the average for student number 1 is, and whatever their average is. Okay, so here's some pseudocode, and pseudocode is very nice to do before you get started throwing down code. So we're going to have these couple counters here and initialize them to 0, and then that sum there about adding up the test scores, we'll call it total. Then we're going to display, enter the number of students, and then we're going to read that number of students, num students. And while the student counter is less than number of students, that's the outer while loop, you go in here, then that's true, and you have the inner while loop, and that's going to keep running as long as the test counter is less than 3, which is the number of test scores that we have. So inside the inner loop, we're going to display, enter a test score, we're going to read that score, update our total equals total plus test score, and then we're going to increment the grade counter, the test counter, if you will, to keep track of how many tests have been captured. And then that while loop will go 1, 2, 3, grab all test scores, and when it completes, we can then calculate the average. And we have to be really careful here because the total was an int and dividing by 3 is an int, and this is integer division, and we want to avoid that. So pay attention on how we're going to take care of that so it isn't integer division. And then we'll display that student, and we'll do a nice display because we'll display which student we're on. But even though it says student counter, this is really going to be student counter plus 1, because normal people, when they're processing the first item, they say number 1 student, even though our counter begins at 0. So computer science folks start counting at 0, normal folks start counting at 1. And then we'll print out the average, and then we're going to reset that accumulator and that test counter, or the grade counter, if you will. Oops, I called it two different things here, grade counter, test counter. It's the same thing here. And then we'll increment the student counter and the outer while, and this outer while loop will continue to process students so long as there are some to do. Now, both of these loops are counter-controlled, so we're not going to have a sentinel or anything, because we already know in advance when the teacher tells us the number of students how many times the outer while loop has to run, and we already know how many tests there are in the class, so the inner loop is counter-controlled as well. So we don't need to do what's known as a priming read, prompting and capturing prior to the while loop begins for either of these while loops. Okay, so now we are going to have to go and do our code. So let's go over to NetBeans, shall we? And we'll code up everything there in NetBeans. So I haven't typed in anything yet because I was hoping that you would open NetBeans and join me on this little journey. So we are going to use the scanner, so guess what we need right here before our public class? You got it, an import statement. So we're going to have import, but with a lowercase I, java.util. And you can either put scanner here, and I like to just put asterisk because it's quicker. And so then I'm going to come down here inside my class. Now remember, we need a main, so we're going to do public static void main, and then parentheses, string, bracket, bracket, args, and then you know that we're going to need a curly brace to start our main. So luckily NetBeans puts in the opening and closing curly braces when we just type in the opening one only. It's very nice for us. We are going to need a scanner, so how about I'll instantiate our scanner object now. I'll call it scan equals, and when you do a new object in Java, you always have to use the word new. That's key. And then parentheses system.in to set up our input stream. And now remember, we have some variables here. So what do we have? We have int student, I'll use camel case notation, student counter, and those counters need to get initialized. We also have the test counter. If you want, you can call it the grade counter. And those are both initialized to 0. What other variables are we using? Well, guess what? We're going to need a accumulator, which we spoke about, to sum up the running total of all the tests when we capture them and initialize that accumulator to 0. But then we also have a couple other variables, number of students, I'll call it num students. That does not need to be initialized, and a variable that we'll capture the test scores with called test score. Finally, I'm going to do average, and you don't need to initialize an average. We calculate that as we go. So that's going to be a decimal value. So now we're ready to begin doing the first reading and capturing, asking the teacher how many students there are so they can tell us what it is. So I'm going to have a prompt here, system.out.print. How about parentheses, quote, enter the number of students, colon, space, double quote, parentheses, semicolon. NetBeans is nice. It gave me a semicolon for me. And then we'll, of course, capture that in the variable we call num students. So you're going to say num students equals the name of your scanner. I named it scan dot, and we're capturing an integer. So we're going to do next int. And then, of course, we'll end it with a semicolon. And then we can begin that outer loop, that outer while loop. So this is going to be the outer while loop. Here we go, while, and we're going to say while the student counter is less than num students. Now, why are we not saying less than or equal to? Because we're starting our student counter at 0, and 0 through the one right before num students is going to be the number of students. So now we're going to put a curly brace in there and have the body of that outer while loop, and we'll immediately start the inner loop. So we'll have another while loop, and this is, remember, counter controlled also with the test counter. So while our test counter, we named that, is less than 3, keep processing the tests for that student. So this is going to need a curly brace also. It's going to have more than one line in it. So what are we doing once we're inside the inner loop? Remember, our pseudocode said we're going to prompt and capture each test score in this loop. So we're going to have another prompt here, system.out.print. And what are we going to ask for? How about double quote, enter a test score, colon, space, double quote, parentheses, semicolon, and then we'll capture that test score in the variable test score, which was also an int. So we're going to say test score equals scan.nextInt and semicolon there. So then what? Well, we're going to keep our running total going here. So we'll say total. You can do it either total equals itself total plus test score, but I'm going to use one of those fancy schmancy combined assignment operators. We're going to do a plus equals test score semicolon, and that's keeping our running total. And don't forget, we don't like infinite loops, so we better make sure that we increment our test counter, otherwise we'll be stuck in that inner loop forever. So there's the inner loop. So this is going to keep prompting and grabbing all of our 3 test scores for a particular student, and then when you're done with that inner loop, you can then calculate your average. Now remember, we want to avoid integer division. So I'm going to say average is equal to total divided by, not question mark, divided by 3.0, and that will ensure that I'm not doing integer division. Another way we could have done it is you could have kept that in integer 3, and you could have put a cast right in front of the variable total. In parentheses, you would have put parentheses int, and then, parentheses double, and cast that to force it to do decimal division instead. So then we're ready to display the average for our student. Did I spell that average wrong? Oh, that's why it's being grouchy with me, giving me an error. Typed it in wrong. So what we're going to do now is we'll do a println, system.out.println, and we're going to be kind of nice here. So we're going to put the average of student space, and then we'll use a concatenator, and then we're going to do student counter plus 1 because normal people don't understand that student number 0. And I'm putting parentheses around here because remember, concatenators are kind of tricky. Sometimes they mean glue things together inside of a print statement, but other times if you want to force it to do addition, which I do here, I put it inside parentheses, and then we'll do another concatenator, and then we'll say double quote is, and then we'll do another space, and then we'll do another concatenator, and then we'll put the average. So I'm trying to see here, AVG, parentheses, semicolon. So that's going to print out our average for that particular student, and now what do we need to do? We need to reset the total back to 0 so it's ready to process for the next student. We're also going to reset the test counter back to 0 so it's ready for the next student. And finally, we're going to increment the student counter, and I forgot that was incorrect camel case notation. Variables have a lowercase to start. And so I think that's good. I think we have the end of the outer loop. And you can put comments in here so it's easier to troubleshoot. I'm just going to put end outer loop here on that curly brace. And then why not? I'll put end inner loop for a comment there, ending the inner loop. And I think we're done. These last 2 curly braces are to end the main. And, of course, the last one is to end the class. Now, the question is this going to work? I don't know. It looks good. I'm going to come over here and do a file save, and then I'll come over here and say run file, enter number of students. I'm going to keep it pretty easy. How about if we just have 2 students so I don't have to do a whole bunch? We're going to enter a test score. Let's say this student is outstanding, 98, 81, 77. And look, they said the average of student 1 is, and we didn't use any format specifiers. We could have used a printf statement instead. It would have looked nicer. And now, look, it's asking us for some more test scores for the second student. So how about if I'll say, I don't know, 70, let's say they got a 22, and let's say they got 100. They were all over the place. And the average of student 2 is 64.0. So this looks pretty good. Now, just before I finish, if we wanted to update this code, let's say this teacher decided to give 4 tests, or maybe we could ask the teacher to enter in the number of total tests also. So we would, instead of a test counter less than 3 here, we could put in some sort of variable depending on what the teacher decided and how many tests they would give. And there's all sorts of other things we can do with this. But I think that's a good start for now for nested loops. Happy programming.